He took your sin and He threw it on His Son, and He trampled His Son down under His own wrath. He took your sin and He put it on His Son, and He threw His Son into the sea of His holy hatred against evil. And His Son suffered every penalty, everything you deserved, until He could cry out, "It is finished."
My sin is imputed to Jesus. His righteousness is imputed to me. And in this twofold transaction, we see that God, who does not negotiate sin, who doesn't compromise His own integrity with our salvation, but rather punishes sin fully and really after it has been imputed to Jesus, retains His own righteousness, and so He is both just and the justifier, as the apostle tells us here. So my sin goes to Jesus, His righteousness comes to me in the sight of God.
In His active obedience, He keeps the whole law. And He is actually righteous, which is important because that means He can impute actual righteousness to you and to me. And you can't stand before God without actual righteousness. And you can't gain that righteousness because you're born in sin. So Christ keeps the whole law and is actually righteous, and He can impute that righteousness to you. But then, as a man, Christ can actually take the penalty that we owe to God for our sin and deal with the other side of it, so that now there can be a double imputation. My sin imputed to Christ, who is born of a woman and can therefore have my sin placed on Him, because the sin belongs to man. But because He's the God-man, His righteousness can be imputed to me, so that Christ can die a vicarious, substitutionary, atoning death on my behalf, satisfying the wrath of God against my actual sin and my inherited sin, and imputing to me the righteousness that is required for me to stand before God in right standing and righteousness.
As He died in our place, bearing our sins, suffering our curse, by the shedding of that blood, He satisfied the righteous anger of God toward us. He placated the holy vengeance of God toward us, so that the Father is now propitiated. By the shedding of His blood on our behalf, He reconciled holy God to sinful man in the blood of His cross, and He brought us to God through His cross. And by the shedding of His blood, He went into the slave market of sin, and He shed His blood, and He purchased the church, and He bought us at the price of His own life upon the cross. It was in our place. We stood guilty before holy God, and Christ stood in our place. Have you come to see the sin-bearing, substitutionary, vicarious death of Christ for sinners?
It is the most precious truth to me, because my sins are so high that only a work like that can save me.